Hello and welcome to the third in a unique set of video briefings from DC employment solicitors arising as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the unprecedented impact that it's having on employment law. In our first collection of videos, I'll be looking at the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, or furlough scheme for short. In the first two episodes, I talked about who's actually covered by the scheme and how to implement it. I also answered some of the frequently asked questions that many of our clients have asked since it was first introduced. So, if you're unfamiliar with the scheme, you may want to start with episodes 1 and 2, which can be found on our website or on the links below. In this episode, I'll be taking a look at the practicalities of the furlough scheme and how it impacts on annual leave. This video was recorded on the 15th of April and takes into account the government's updated guidance published on the 4th of April, and it also reflects the amendments made to the holidays section of the ACAS guidance made on the 7th of April. However, as the guidance is continually changing, in order to keep updated, please have a look at our guidance notes on our website. Again, all of the links are below, and they're regularly refreshed as more information comes to light. As an aside, many thanks for your comments on the videos to date, along with the rather helpful decorating tips for changing the paint colour in my study at Tibble Towers. So, let's get started. So firstly, will employees continue to accrue holiday during furlough leave? It is likely that the 5.6 weeks leave under the Working Time Regulations 1998 continues to accrue during furlough leave. The position is analogous to an employee who's, say, on sabbatical in this respect. It is, of course, always open to the employer to attempt to negotiate a change in contractual terms so that any annual leave over and above the statutory leave doesn't accrue during furlough leave. But this may make it less attractive to employees to want to agree to go on to furlough leave. Can workers carry forward annual leave if they're prevented from taking it due to the pandemic? ACAS advice for employers and employees suggests that the new carryover rule could apply where a worker has been put on furlough leave. However, it's not yet clear how the government intends furlough leave to interact with annual leave. Further guidance is required on whether it's possible to be on annual leave whilst on furlough leave. And it's also unclear whether a period of annual leave will disrupt furlough leave, because the latter can only be taken in minimum blocks of 3 weeks. If it's not possible to take annual leave during furlough, then it would clearly not be reasonably practicable to take the annual leave at that time. However, if the worker then had enough time in the remainder of the holiday leave year to take their annual leave once furlough has ended, then arguably the new rule on carryover would still not apply. The position would likely be different if, on return to work, the employer suspends annual leave in order to have the full workforce available to focus on rebuilding the business following the pandemic. If it is possible for workers to take annual leave during furlough, then it's questionable whether furlough leave in itself renders it not reasonably practicable for the worker to take the leave in the relevant leave year. However, if the employer directs workers not to take annual leave during furlough, then it would clearly not be reasonably practicable for workers to take their annual leave at that time. I think it's likely that if an employer simply says nothing about annual leave, then the worker may reasonably assume that they're effectively on standby during their furlough leave and not entitled to take annual leave, and it was therefore not reasonably practicable to do so. It's also potentially arguable that a period of furlough leave which coincides with a period of full or partial lockdown would render it not reasonably practicable that the worker could take their leave at that time on the basis that they're unable to enjoy rest and relaxation, although it may be a stretch to argue that being confined to home is equivalent to not being able to rest and relax. Only the working time directive leave, i.e. 4 weeks, can be carried forward under the new regulations. However, the 1.6 weeks additional leave provided under the UK regulations, making up the overall statutory minimum, may already be carried forward into the next leave year in accordance with a relevant agreement. In many circumstances where employers want to take advantage of the new carryover right, employers will need to put in place a relevant agreement, if one doesn't already exist, and allow carryover of all statutory holiday, not just the working time directive leave, where such holiday is unable to be taken due to coronavirus. This is because the Working Time Regulations 1998 oblige employers to allow workers the opportunity to take 5.6 weeks leave each year, regardless of whether it's reasonably practicable to do so. If an employer fails to allow additional leave to be taken and refuses to allow it to be carried over under a relevant agreement, this would amount to a breach of the Working Time Regulations. Of course, practicalities come into play here, and I suspect that the Employment Tribunal would be sympathetic to employers acting in the best way possible to secure their business and jobs. But employment law can sometimes be an unpredictable and funny old thing, as I'm sure you're all well aware. Next, can annual leave be taken during furlough? From a straightforward working time regulations perspective, it is likely that workers can take annual leave during furlough. However, employers are likely to be concerned with the effect of taking annual leave on their ability to obtain reimbursement from HMRC. Unfortunately, the interaction between annual leave and furlough leave isn't currently clear, and there are several potential issues with allowing or requiring workers to take annual leave during furlough, which can be a cause for concern. For example, annual leave may not be treated as furlough leave, and so the pay may not be recoverable from HMRC under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Also, furlough leave needs to be taken in blocks of 3 weeks, so it arguably can't be interrupted by annual leave. Even if annual leave during furlough doesn't end furlough leave, then the employer still may not be able to recover the holiday pay in full. Some workers will be entitled to more than their furlough pay in respect of any annual leave, and so the difference between the furlough pay and the holiday pay wouldn't be recoverable. I'll consider this in more detail in a second. So, can a worker take their statutory annual leave during furlough leave? It is likely that a worker could choose to take their statutory holiday during furlough leave if they wanted to do so and gave the required notice, provided that their employer hasn't designated furlough leave as a period during which no annual leave may be taken. A worker on furlough leave retains their employment rights subject to any contractual variation in terms of pay, so it seems unlikely that being on furlough leave would affect their rights under the Working Time Regulations. However, whether it will be in the worker's interest to do that depends upon the pay they'll receive in respect of their annual leave. If the worker receives less than their furlough pay during the annual leave, then there will be little benefit in using that leave, given that they're not required to work in any event and will receive the same pay. For various reasons, the employer may want to provide that workers aren't entitled to take annual leave during furlough. As I've mentioned, this is because payment in respect of annual leave may not be recoverable, and it may interrupt furlough leave, rendering other payments also non-recoverable. Can an employer require a worker to take holiday during furlough? Until there's any further clarity, employers looking at their short-term financial position may decide not to instruct workers to take their annual leave in order to avoid making payment which isn't recoverable from HMRC. Employers may go further than that and designate furlough leave as a period during which no annual leave may be taken, at least until there's further guidance available. Given that it is possible to carry leave forward to the next 2 holiday years, the employer may be less concerned than it otherwise would be about workers having annual leave accrued on their return from furlough leave. Some employers may take the view that HMRC have not explicitly excluded holiday pay from the sums that can be recovered. They may choose to direct workers to take annual leave, giving the notice required under the Working Time Regulations, on the basis that HMRC will pay for it, at least up to the cap. However, there is a risk that HMRC audit the employer's application for reimbursement and determine that the holiday pay is not recoverable, or worse, that the annual leave has broken the period of furlough leave, such that the furlough pay isn't recoverable either. From a working time regulations perspective, the government guidance at the time that the employer is considering requiring the worker to take the leave may also be relevant. In the context of self-isolation and annual leave, a period during which an employer is unable to enjoy rest and relaxation could not be designated as annual leave by the employer, and a worker would be entitled to rescheduled, pre-arranged annual leave during such a period. It may be arguable that a total lockdown which puts furloughed workers in effectively the same position as people who are subject to self-isolation could be interpreted as a period during which it's not possible to enjoy rest and relaxation. That argument is not without difficulties, and in my view it's likely to be weaker in the current state of lockdown, where the public is entitled to leave their homes for certain identified reasons, such for example as exercise. Can an employer require employees to take accrued holiday once the furlough period comes to an end? In principle, the employer could require that annual leave is taken once the furlough period has ended. However, the employer would need to give sufficient notice as required under the working time regulations or any relevant agreement. What pay is a worker entitled to where they take annual leave during furlough leave? Statutory holiday pay entitlement depends upon whether the worker has normal working hours and how they're paid. Either way, it's likely that full pay is required for any holiday rather than based on furlough pay. The reason for this is that as the normal working hours of a worker who's on furlough leave have arguably not changed, there's a good argument that their annual leave is payable at the rate of a normal week's pay and not at the rate they're receiving for the temporary period that they're not working on furlough. For workers without normal fixed hours, you need to calculate their average pay. But remember, it's only average remuneration for working weeks which is taken into account. Whole weeks of absence are left out of the calculation. This means that whole weeks of furlough leave will likely not be taken into account, and holiday pay will be based on the relevant reference period before furlough leave started. If the worker's pay has been reduced for furlough leave, then this means that they may, depending on their earnings during the reference period, be better off taking annual leave if they're allowed to do so. Where workers work hours that are variable, it is a complex area and you should contact us for further advice. It's a situation that requires a bit more time than this broadcast will allow. What happens to bank holidays which fall during furlough leave? For the reasons I've already mentioned, the employer may want to cancel any annual leave which falls within a furlough leave period, including bank holidays which have been designated as annual leave, if there's enough time before the leave for the employer to give the required notice under the working time regulations. If it's then not reasonably practicable for the cancelled annual leave to be taken in the remainder of the leave year, and if those days fall within the worker's statutory leave entitlement, the leave should be carried forward to the next holiday year. However, if the employer decides to continue to treat the bank holidays as statutory annual leave, then the employees on furlough leave should be paid accordingly. So that was a swift tour through the practical implications on annual leave during furloughing. As I've mentioned, the guidance on this topic is rapidly changing, and therefore it's always sensible to keep checking the guidance on our website for the most up-to-date information, particularly on this topic, which is still quite complicated and still a little vague. In the next episode, I'll look at the further frequently asked questions that have arisen over the past few weeks. Thanks for watching.